Thank you all for coming. This afternoon, we're going to start our session on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we'll have three presenters and a discussant, Titus Awokashe from Michigan State University. I'm excited to be here with my colleagues from ERS. And thank you to Michael Johnson and also to Jakob Zeresius for helping to organize the session and making this track session possible. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today, I'm going to be presenting some joint work with my colleagues Jared Ferris and Jason Beckman at the USDA Economic Research Service on evaluating the effects of non-tariff measures on poultry trade. And just on behalf of myself and my colleagues, I'll go ahead and cover that the findings and conclusions that we present here today are those of the authors and shouldn't be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. So why are we interested in non-tariff barriers or measures? We generally think of them as barriers to trade. And specifically, if you're not familiar, NTM or non-tariff measure is anything other than an ordinary customs tariff that may affect both the quantities and the value of trade flows. And in general, we tend to think that NTMs are trade barriers, right? Or they impede the flow of trade. For agriculture, we generally talk about four big different categories of NTMs that are important. The first are tariff rate quotas, which are, quota systems combined with sort of ascending tariff rates. There are also sanitary and phytosanitary measures. There are technical barriers to trade. Those can be things like restrictions or rules on the size, color, packaging of different products. And then there are special safeguards, which these are implements that a country can use or mechanisms a country can use when there's an event or something that might injure a domestic industry. In the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, NTMs are important because they may represent sort of large barriers to trade flows within the continent. Specifically, the World Bank Group has estimated or simulated that the agreement may actually result in a decline in MTM rates of approximately 17 percentage points for agriculture, right? So in the context of this agreement and future rounds of negotiation, this may represent a real opportunity to significantly increase trade flows. However, it's also important to understand that the effects of non-tariff measures can actually vary based on the product and the specific type of NTM that gets implemented. So like I said, generally, we view NTMs as barriers. Why are they barriers? Well, they can create significant information and compliance cost for exporters to get their products in line and to meet these requirements. Other measures such as sanitary and phytosanitary and technical barriers, they may even just prevent products from entering the market altogether. However, recent research has also showed that some of these measures can actually be trade enhancing, which is something that we don't think a lot about. Specifically, if you're thinking about it, compliance with sanitary and phytosanitary measures may actually send positive signals to consumers, right? So if you believe that, people who are the imports coming into your country are now complying with a more rigorous set of safety standards or health rules, maybe you're more inclined to purchase those products. Also, labeling and packaging can also be low-cost ways to signal product quality and actually get people to buy more products. So the question that we're going to try to answer today and start to explore is how do different non-tariff measures affect the value of poultry trade in general, and then specifically in Africa. So what we want to do is we want to try to provide estimates of the effects of four different types of non-tariff measures on global poultry trade. We want to investigate whether and to what extent those non-tariff measures affect the value of African poultry trade, and how those effects might end up differing from other regions. And then in future work, we actually want to focus on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement specifically. So this is a fairly data-intensive project. So we're using bilateral trade data for 8 different poultry products. Specifically, this data comes from Trade Data Monitor. We have information on poultry data or poultry trade flows from 93 importers, 211 exporters. We include 8 different poultry-related HS codes for both fresh and for frozen meat. There's clearly a lot of missingness in international trade data. So we use a mirroring process to fill in missing values. So when we're collecting this data, we first prioritize importer reported statistics. When those are not available, we substitute in exporter reported statistics for each trade dyad that we're including. Here, what we're presenting in the graph is the value of poultry trade by region. You can see that imports and exports are highest in Eurasia. They're relatively small imports in Africa. And Africa has negligible poultry exports in 2019. So our data on non-tariff measures are the non-tariff measures that are reported to the World Trade Organization. So these come from the Integrated Trade Intelligence Portal. We're using these WTO member notifications of non-discriminatory NTMs that are imposed on poultry trade on an annual basis, right? So when we say non-discriminatory, these are different from some other trade measures that might be imposed, like a tariff, in that they're applying to all trading partners when a country imposes them. And that actually presents some challenges for estimation and identification. So we break these out by the type of NTM imposed. And here what we're showing is just the graph of the count of different NTMs that were notified by African countries from 1995 through 2019. What you see here is that we only pick up tariff rate quotas that were notified in 1995, I think on poultry specifically. And so this was for Morocco, I believe. We don't actually capture any special safeguard measures for Africa, which will obviously have implications for our estimation. But you can see that there are a relatively high number, and there's a lot of variation in both technical barriers to trade and SPS measures. Other data sources that we also include domestic trade flows. So this is the sort of share of production that's consumed within the country. We get this from FAO, the value of agricultural production, on the same 8 poultry HS codes. We calculate domestic trade as sort of the value of domestic production minus the value of exports. We also use other standard gravity model variables, which are distance between partners, the region that they're from, sharing a common language, colonial history, or having a trade agreement between partners. We use a pretty standard gravity model structure here, where the dependent variable are going to be the nominal value of poultry trade between 2 trading partners. We have a vector of gravity variables. So these are things that I just mentioned, like distance between trading partners. And then our key measure of interest here is going to be the interaction between the different non-tariff measures and the fact that it's an international trade flow. So this is how we actually achieve identification, is because we include the domestic trade flows in the model, we're actually able to get this variation between these sort of the effects of non-discriminatory tariffs on trade that goes outside of the country versus where they don't apply for internal trade. And then we also include exporter year fixed effects and importer year fixed effects. As another measure, we also use a different fixed effect structure where we include asymmetric pair fixed effects. So we sort of drop those individual gravity variables that control for these different effects on these trade dyads. And we include instead like an asymmetric pair fixed effect. And what that means is that there would be sort of a different indicator for when we have 2 trading pairs. So there's one indicator capturing when China's the importer and the US is the exporter. And there's a separate fixed effect indicator for when the US is the importer and China is the exporter. So we capture those going both directions. Like I mentioned, our identification strategy leverages international trade flows. So this way, these non-discriminatory NTMs can be identified in the presence of all these fixed effects. We use a Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood estimator, which is sort of standard in the gravity literature right now. And then we focus on these indicators for different types of non-tariff measures. And we also sort of break the data set down by how the notifications happen to the World Trade Organization. So each measure is classified as it's either initiated, so they're planning on putting this non-tariff measure in force, it's in force, or we look at both. So I just want to present some preliminary results. So these results reflect effects on global poultry trade, right? So this is not Africa specific. And our first key finding is that tariff rate quotas significantly reduce the value of poultry trade across specifications. So we have negative and significant effects. These are all significant at the 0.1% level. So that's what 3 stars means here. And these are all T statistics in parentheses. So we have this negative effect, which you might expect for TRQs. However, if we look at the other non-tariff measures here, we actually see positive and significant coefficients more generally. And so there's some preliminary evidence that's robust across specifications for sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade, that they may have a positive effect on the general value of poultry trade. And again, this goes back to the idea that if these are providing information to consumers for something like poultry meat, that it's adhering to sort of a higher quality or better health standards, and it's safer to consume, this might actually be trade enhancing. Again, these are preliminary results, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the Q&A. We also include an interaction effect to look at sort of, can we find any differential effects for Africa? That graph I showed you of the NTMs in Africa over the period of this analysis, you'll remember that we had very little variation in tariff rate quotas, and there were no special safeguard notifications. So those will drop out of the model. But here we find some evidence that for Africa, compared to in general, sanitary and phytosanitary measures actually have a larger negative effect compared to poultry trade in general. So this suggests that there might be some level of regional heterogeneity, and that in the context of the sort of new protocol negotiations in the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that are addressing these NTMs, that may represent a significant place to increase the value of poultry trade for the continent. So again, overall, we find these heterogeneous effects. For general poultry trade, we have evidence of negative effects of tariff rate quotas, some evidence that other non-tariff measures may provide positive signals. But again, I think it's important for this work to discuss some of the limitations. So again, data is a big issue here. So when we're thinking about these models, country and poultry HS code coverage for the value of own production, there's a lot of missingness. So there's sort of a real need to go through and collect, sort of collate some of that domestic production data to better fill in countries that tend to be missing, especially in Africa. It's also important that here we're looking at the value of trade. We're also exploring looking at the quantity of poultry trade. That's sort of complex because of the units in which poultry trade are measured. So sometimes poultry is exported in pieces versus kilograms or other measures. So that's sort of a units issue. And then we also need to think about sort of the aggregate effects of multiple NTMs, right? So here we just have an indicator if something was implemented, but there may have been multiple happening. So, while we may find a positive effect, they could cancel each other out. They could operate differently when they're both in effect. And then finally, especially in the case of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, it's important to start to think about intra-regional trade flows, which is something that we're aiming to do in future work. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here. Like, share, and follow ERS. I think they're tweeting this session, so you should all retweet that. And I'm happy to take any questions, or if you have any comments later on, feel free to reach out to myself or Jared or Jason. But thank you.
I have one or two questions now, and then we can have more questions.
Samantha Padilla. So for the folks online, Sam's question is, where would a ban on poultry imports fall? So that it depends on how the ban was notified. So it would fall into the correct sort of category. So that would actually depend on sort of the mechanisms that government was using in the WTO structure. That's a really good point. I think we could go back and do a better job of exploring how we would classify the different types of NTMs, and also look at sort of the heterogeneity in what countries are imposing what types. Yeah, I think isolating the effects of the major markets like Nigeria would be helpful. So thank you for that comment. Yes. Distance is measured in miles. And that's actually a really interesting point because in sort of building this data set, so our interaction term is going to sort of capture that any domestic trade would then have a distance of 0. But that's also sort of an interesting conceptual point because, within a country, it might not have a distance of 0. but that's how it would be treated in the model. But yes, it's measured in miles, probably to the centroid. Yes. So our preliminary explanation is that, again, it has to do with sort of sending those positive signals to consumers. Now, this could be through packaging or through labeling or something like that. But I agree, we sort of need to dig deeper into that to better understand what could be driving this effect. Yes.
So you do have the importer year and exporter year. Very interested in selection bias and that maybe like if we're looking at two response to the third and that's like the positive coefficient. So just curious about looking at lab effects and time that we can, or even in the absence of previous survey, a perception there would be.
Yes, that's a really good point. So we have looked at single year lagged effects and the results were robust to that. But we haven't explored higher level lags and also sort of digging in. We also have some concerns about sort of the notification data about, you know, what actually ends up being implemented or if it maybe wasn't notified. So there could even be informal NTMs that operate in that effect that we might want to think about. And that kind of gets back to the other point about some of these bans. Yes. Correct. Yeah. Thank you for that point. That's a great point. Right. We can definitely check that. Thanks for that suggestion. Sorry, what? It's in value here. We're hoping to explore quantity because I think that's also important to think about in this context. But again, sort of the issue that we've run into initially is how poultry trade is reported. And so, you know, some countries just report unit in pieces, which sort of finding a consistent way to sort of aggregate that. Exactly. Yes, so this was a challenge. There's also a challenge in how some domestic production is reported. So if you've worked with poultry, there's sort of what they call there is poultry, and then there's sort of also included is I don't know, when I was working in Zambia, I would call it like, you know, just local chicken that's probably not for trade. So we've excluded the local here, but there's also some extra production, indigenous poultry meat. Yeah. No, these would be official technical barriers or standards that are imposed that were notified or placed in force and communicated to the World Trade Organization. So probably not supply chain issues. All right, thank you all. Get that out of your way.
We want to keep sharing the screen, yeah? Oh, I got it. Wait. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, boomer. Okay, got it. All right. Thanks all. Okay, so this is a fun project for me. This is really a sort of uncharted territory in terms of like methods for myself. So this is joint work with Kate and Michael at the URS, my colleagues at the URS, and then Greg and Savannah, who are climate modelers at the University of Florida. And really what we're trying to do in this presentation in particular is just sort of like understand what are some of the implications for climate change on livestock in Africa, and for the sake of sort of motivating sort of future work and looking at some climate simulations with particular sort of thought about input needs for livestock in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so this is just a map of the distribution of livestock across the continent. Livestock includes cattle, goats, chickens, and pigs, and there's quite a bit of it. A lot of livestock population lives in this sort of southern part of the Sahel region, and Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. And sort of just keep this picture in mind when I start showing some of the simulation results and maps from our simulations or projections going forward, because I think the sort of overlap will be striking.
Could you put the slides in presenter mode for the Zoom?
Oh,
for
sure.
Online? Thank you.
It's already shared, right?
Okay, it needs to be in.
Or maybe you have to put it out here. Yeah, that's okay.
But this is how it was before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think it's okay.
Right. The slides don't change, and the whole last presentation, we never got past the title slide.
Oh, interesting. Maybe we do need a tech person. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyhow, don't want to slow it up for those in the room.
Sure. Thanks for letting us know. Not sure what's the cause of that. I'm going to keep going if that's okay. Okay, so demand for livestock in Africa, we think is going to increase for several reasons. Okay, so a tech person is coming. Seems like the slides aren't changing on the
On their side.
Let's see.
That should be it.
Okay.
It's okay now.
Is it?
It's okay now.
It's okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
The presenter mode, right?
Now it seems stuck. Yeah. Now we're not.
It's working now.
There you go.
There you go.
That move for you guys? Online?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. All right. So demand for livestock in Africa, we expect to increase for several reasons. One, population growth, but also rising incomes. We know from observations in a variety of different settings that preferences for food, and particularly for meat products, increase as incomes rise, and also along with urbanization. So some estimates suggest that consumers will demand over 100 million tons more meat by 2050. And yeah, so this is just a really important sort of characteristic and setting for understanding this potential implications for climate change on livestock. And there's a variety of different mechanisms that could persist in how climate change could influence livestock. And the one that we're going to focus on today is the quantity and quality of feed. So that's dependent on temperature and extreme weather events. So what we are sort of interested in and concerned with is this woody plant encroachment, where herbaceous plants, the plants that livestock feed on primarily, are replaced by woody plants that are not as nutritious or palatable for cattle to consume. There's other mechanisms as well that are certainly relevant that we're sort of not focusing on in this sort of climate modeling in this presentation. Okay, so the other sort of thing to consider is that livestock in Africa is a particularly vulnerable industry. So for a variety of different reasons. Poverty is obviously a large factor, but also there are a few resources or little resources for agricultural inputs and mechanization that sort of constrains the productivity of the livestock industry. So there's a possibility that we could see farming systems shift away from sort of growing crops into producing and cultivating livestock. But this would sort of increase increase the dependence on livestock and obviously would constrain the resources for the inputs in sustaining a livestock crop. And also seasonality that is maybe increasingly dependent on climate change also has an influence on where livestock crops or where livestock herds feed and where they need to feed. And this can lead to increased conflict in the region. And I'd like to just sort of pause on this point for a minute. So this is some pictures from a paper by McGurk and Nunn, and they sort of show this relationship between seasonal migration of livestock herders, who in the wet season are grazing their livestock in the northern regions here, and people primarily growing on agricultural land in their southern regions of West Africa here. In the dry season, these herders move down for greener pastures, literally speaking. And while these agricultural lands are sort of in the dry season, there's this actual symbiotic relationship between herders and farmers, where farmers are getting sort of free fertilizer. Cattle are sort of aerating land. They're not using the land for growing crops anyways. But as climate change changes the agricultural seasons, these groups are sort of butting heads over the use of land. And this could increase the prevalence of conflict. McGurk and Nunn find evidence of this mechanism using quite a few years of data. And this is sort of an important sort of tangential sort of mechanism that's occurring when we think about the influence of climate change on livestock, and in particular through a mechanism of causing increased conflict. All right, so what do we do in this presentation? The climate modelers at the University of Florida use this approach called G-range simulation, or this model called G-range simulation, which is a climate model that simulates changes in vegetation availability based on inputs from weather models. So what we're really looking at here is it projects the annual and perennial herbaceous plants, shrubs, and trees, both plant, shrub, and trees area, and also total biomass of all of these things. And there's a few things that I'd like to highlight about the G-range simulation. We're looking at sort of very, very small grid cells across, we could look at across the entire world. We're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa in this presentation, and we're looking at specifically areas of grassland, shrubland, and tree land, and then also the total sort of biomass in these areas as well. And we're going to simulate G-range simulations for two representative concentration pathways. This was a new term for me, and it may be for many of you here, but these are sort of two ways or two possibilities of the way that climate could change in the future. RCP 4.5 is sort of a conservative approach. RCP 8.5 is a more sort of extreme situation. And we're modeling this in 2040 with a base year of 2017. And we're looking at changes to grassland, shrubland, and woodland, and also total biomass. All right, so here's sort of what our results are going to look like. We have each panel is the sort of the pathway of climate change, RCP 4.5 and RPC 8.5, and different colors here. Sort of reddish colors or increasingly reddish colors are losses in either area or biomass. Greenish colors are gains, and more yellowish colors are sort of no change. So what we see here is mostly sort of no change in grass area. Some areas we see sort of gains in grass area. Maybe a couple areas where we're seeing losses, but here we're saying, oh, this doesn't actually look too terrible in terms of sort of total grass area. When we look at shrub area, we see it even looks even more sort of blah, like nothing's really changing a whole lot in terms of total area of shrub area. And the similar thing when we look at tree area change as well. The big story here is about total biomass. So now this isn't just looking at sort of the area, which is the first three photos here, but the total amount of actual vegetation that is available for livestock to consume. And if you remember the sort of distribution, the area distribution of where livestock herds preside in sub-Saharan Africa, largely overlapping in these areas where we're seeing the largest amount of reduction in total biomass. And in particular, for both of these sort of scenarios, it's sort of invariant to the sort of climate change scenario that we assume in this model. Okay, so just to summarize these results, the land area changes, we see small changes to grassland changes, largest changes in Sudan and South Sudan, small increases, but nothing really substantial for shrubland and tree area. The big story here is biomass changes. We see a systematic decrease in total biomass available by 2040. This is in contrast or in the face of increasing demand for livestock with decreasing available biomass for the availability of these livestock. So this is probably, this is quite a motivating and striking result. The climate modelers want me to emphasize and point out that this is just one model. There's lots of different ways to model the environment, to model climate change. But this is these results are consistent with a lot of the results in the climate literature. So this motivates some next steps for us and for others to try to understand adaptation possibilities for Africa's livestock system amid a changing climate. So some possibilities are investigating risk management practices, investigating the role of diversification, and then also investigating the role of and the possibility of sustainable intensification for smallholder farmers and larger farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's all I have for today. Yeah.
So, thank you for telling us to record the map at the beginning of your presentation. The areas you highlighted, I know you said that conflict may be an issue as climate change is happening, but conflict is already there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very intense. The seasonal migrations of toilets have been disrupted at times because of that conflict. So, how does that relate to your results now? You know what I mean? Is there a way for you to take into account that the high levels of pre-existing conflict now?
So I mean, the conflict stuff isn't really going into the climate model. It's more of a, I was raising it as like, this is a, the relationship between climate change and livestock is also related to conflict on the continent. And there's like really interesting work about how, migration, in fact, of livestock herders, in particular response to changing weather and seasonal climate conditions, butts up against the land use of sedentary farmers. It doesn't really get into the climate model, but it does the climate model that will exacerbate that issue, right? So it's that's another outcome that we could think about rather than an input into the climate model. Yeah. Yeah.
So you've been looking ahead to 2040.
Yes.
It would be interesting to see the loss of what is the consequence in climate change and how does that relate to what you've done?
Yeah.
Because then you see whether that has changed or have actually been over the 8 years more or less.
Right. That's a great idea. I think we should try to do that. Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. Yeah.
They have worked with different climate models in West Africa, the Livestock project, and the various downscalings of the alternative climate models give rather different results. Which one did you think?
I knew I was going to get a question I didn't have the answer to about the specifics of the climate model, and that this is one of them. Yeah, I like my contribution was not running the climate model. Okay. Which one do you think we should be using?
There is no clear answer.
Okay, yeah.
So, we really have to
Yeah,
downscale in the various contexts.
right.
It's an open issue.
Yeah, yeah.
And it relates to the efficiencies of climate data and weather stations.
Yeah.
It's a proofing. It's so difficult.
I attended one of the earlier meetings when they did some of these projections.
Yeah.
And, you know, the obviously our situation find backward scenarios where you think right. But because we also introduced the CGE model, like a prefab, it's a static model. We didn't want to go too far off in the future, but they ran these simulations we were just afraid if we try to follow the CGE model, everything is up.
Yeah.
Biomass is measured from NDVI.
No, but it's related to that sort of thing, but it's not. That is something that I asked specifically about. Yeah. Yeah.
It's been a long time since I worked on livestock issues in West Africa, but I'm very curious about future directions for this kind of work. In particular, one theme that from the 90s was extremely interesting, and it's the question of the manure flow in Africa and nitrogen cycling around manure management. So what was happening in the 90s was enclosure, right, where there was this dramatic increase in the fraction of all cattle and goats that were enclosed to harvest manure and to integrate livestock, where Africa was the one continent with open loss of manure being predominantly the norm.
Right.
And that might be ending in Africa, that Africa would become a more typical continent where most of the livestock is integrated in cropping.
Right.
Most of the manure is captured, where much of the resulting nitrogen is cycled instead of lost. So this is great coming out of like left field.
Sure.
I'm really curious, like for your ERS agenda on livestock crop integration.
Yeah.
Motivation in terms of conflict is super interesting.
Uh-huh.
But it's also an upside of integration.
Right.
Right. And an upside of crop livestock management that captures all this herbaceous material that has to be ruminant digested to be useful, and then capture manure with stabling.
Right.
Right. With a roof over the animal at night. Capturing manure. Is that something that's on the agenda as you think about it?
I hadn't included.
On livestock?
Yeah, I hadn't included that specifically. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot, like this McGurk non-paper, like sort of, it's hard to put estimates on the total number of like sort of people who are doing like involved in like migratory livestock herding, but they estimate that it's like 25% of the population of Africa is like doing some, like at some point doing some sort of like migratory livestock. And this doesn't relate to the like, the specific thing, but I think about it in terms of like, if they're crossing international borders, like this is like the free trade agreement has got to have some sort of influence on this sort of cross-border thing. So I'm thinking about things like that, but we haven't really thought about the specific, issues with like, integrating, integration and how that would influence like reducing conflict and reducing use of scarce land and things like that. Interesting stuff. Yeah.
They are now talking with nature based, so we should set that small agriculture. where that component is much more recycled and helps from that climate change and the whole kind of piece into it. And that is something very interesting, complex interaction.
Small piece of information. If you look at NDVI change in this area, between late 1980s, where they have first satellites, and about 2015 or so, we did that. They have an increase in biomass. So something very dramatic seems to happen that we trust the planning model. That this goes in the opposite direction. Surprising that it's exciting. Southern Sahel is green and has been green in the last 2 decades.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think great points. We can certainly have some more discussion later on. Now have a curve.
This is mine, right? Oh, good. Thank you. Okay. That's all there. Thank you. And for those online as well, thank you for attending this. And just wanted to sort of pick up on Will's question about how the motivation for our research as well, and what Jeff was also alluding to. This actually was kind of our motivator, was the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, in thinking about, how we're going to have more growth in interregional trade. Countries become more economically integrated under the agreement, but also the kinds of dynamics we're seeing on the continent with urbanization and growth, particularly these mega cities. So we're going to see growing demand for more livestock type products. Africa already is a major deficit in terms of its own food production. It's importing more and more. And so we see this growing as well. So trying to think of the implications of what would happen to on the livestock side, because we know that's where we're going to see this big growth. And that's kind of where our motivation came out of. How we're going to move forward is a good question, I think. So you're asking some good questions for us. We'll be kind of rethinking some of this as well as we move forward. So now, having kind of had these 2 presentations as our motivators, trying to understand some of these, particularly both on NTMs. That's one measure that we've been finding very difficult in terms of finding good data on estimates of NTMs, particularly when you want to plug these into some of these simulation models. So we're starting with the poultry, trying to see if we can get some better NTM measures. And then, of course, with the livestock, trying to figure out, with climate change as well, and the role that we also know trade can also help mitigate some of the effects climate change has with more liberalized trade in the region. So to what extent, in this case now, having had some of these simulations on changes in total biomass, what implications would that have on trade, production and trade in Africa, and to what extent AfCFTA may actually maybe even help mitigate those effects a bit through more open trade. But before I go, I just want to make sure I mention contributions of the co-authors on this work we're doing. Jason Backman and Maros, I'm glad you walked in the door. Just in case there are questions on GTAP, I might reach over to you. Both Jason and Maros have been very involved in the GTAP work and the simulations on this as well. And Jakob is working with us on the food security, and he's here with helping moderate on this. Of course, these findings and conclusions are those of us, the authors, should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government policy or determination, and of course supported by ERS. And the way I'm going to proceed with the presentation is what is this AfCFTA and what it promises. Quite a lot of studies have been done on this, talk about the motivation and goals of this work, and then sort of go through some of these non-tariff measures and total trade costs that Africa in particular faces relative to other regions. And then I will pick up on what Jeff already presented, the results that we had from the G-range simulations and how these come into the global trade analysis, and then present some of these results for you. And then in conclusion, showing just how much climate change will not only reduce the expected gains from the AfTA, but that the AfTA itself may actually, that companies will really affect production and trade in Africa, but AfTA itself may actually help mitigate some of this as well. Well, we know AfTA potentially the Africa free trade, continental free trade area is becoming one of the largest free trade areas in terms of just people and number of countries. 55 countries, 1.3 billion people. A major opportunity of the free trade area is to attract investments, trade, diversify exports, accelerate income growth. And the scope of it is pretty large, especially from reducing these non-tariff barriers and costs that you see as well as we move forward. The motivation, particularly in focusing on climate change, there is a consensus, and this recent IPCC report this year concluded Africa will be the hardest hit, and both livestock and crops. And of particular concern is when we look at this demand for livestock that's projected to increase, while we also see African pastoral livestock systems are particularly vulnerable to climate change effects, as Jeff was alluding to earlier. And we know that although trade liberalization can partially offset these, we hope to show some of this with the AfTA, it's really an empirical question as to how much, and so whether how good this modeling work is going to be to get us closer to those projections. The goal of the study, therefore, is to estimate the extent to which the AfCFTA, when fully implemented, could help mitigate the effects of climate change. We apply both this biophysical G-range model and CGE GTAP model from Purdue. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will not only eliminate tariffs, of course, once it's fully operational, but work to help harmonize some of these non-tariff measures, the SPS, the technical barriers, and hopefully with that may actually reduce some of these. But what's really more striking about some of this data is you see that the main issue for Africa are the total trade costs, and these are just other trade costs aside from NTMs. And we also see some of the projections that have been done using GTAP in lowering NTMs. You do, of course, get more of an impact in NTM reductions than you do in tariff reductions, but you get even a bigger impact if you improve trade facilitation, lowering logistics costs, improved infrastructure, and that sort of thing. In this case, therefore, what I'm presenting is sort of showing you some variation as well, the difficulty of getting those estimates correct. And so these are ad valorem equivalents, percentages of the first two columns on the left, and one was done by the World Bank, and one more recently by IFPRI, Nguyen, Boye, and Traore, and in which they also come up with even slightly higher estimates of NTMs, but these are across the board. So these are just, they include a Jensen inequality in their estimates, so that they were just sort of trying to prove that excluding that inequality will bias your estimates. And in their case, it actually jumps it up quite a bit. But also you see, you know, obviously, as we know, Europe is some of the highest in terms of SPS and some of the technical barriers. So they do even higher than Africa in this case, in both cases, estimates. But it's when you look at the total trade costs, Africa is up there with other developing countries, much higher than the world average. And this data is from the World Bank's and ESCAP trade cost database. And here again, I always find striking when you start looking at the actual bilateral trade costs. And here I'm just sort of putting these on top of each other in terms of each continent. So your far right is Africa, and each of those blocks, its own trade costs with those different regions. And fascinating enough, even Africa within Africa, the trade costs are just as comparable as trading with other regions outside of Africa. That's a serious problem as well in terms of looking at how much the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to really have some significant results. They need to focus on lowering those trade costs. And then when we look at the G-range simulations, and this just sort of putting it in a simpler way, not having a range of percentage changes, but just saying as long as there's a negative change, this is the areas where you do see the impact on total biomass in this case. So the red is the negative changes in total biomass by 2040 at the global level. And we see, as just eyeballing it, you can see that Africa is one that's getting really hit hard. The other would be Latin America and a few other spots around the world. So now we use some of these results. We want to plug this into the Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP simulation. We also had to, of course, looking into the future, decide on what sort of socioeconomic pathway we would project to 2040 in order to put these parameters in the GTAP model as well. And we chose to use the middle of the road growth, the SSP2, project this for 2040. And this is from the CEPI database, one of the best for this sort of data. The population growth, and we take that for the demand growth, and the TFP estimates for the supply side. We first project production, incomes, welfare changes by 2040, just under the base SSP2 scenario, without any climate change or the introduction of the Continental Free Trade Area. We then first introduced climate change, this choosing the worst case scenario of these representative concentration pathways, taking the 8.5. And climate shocks in GTAP are measured in terms of change in land available for crops and livestock. In this case, we're sort of assuming this change in total biomass is affecting land availability. Next, we introduced the free trade area under the climate change environment. This is to capture a fully operational free trade area. We remove tariffs and then reduce the NTMs by 25%. The NTMs we use here, we draw on the more recent estimates by IFPRI, by Nguyen, 2021. However, we adapt this using the World Bank AsCap trade costs because of the incomplete data. For a lot of the NTM estimates, sometimes you only get 6 African countries that you're actually getting data from to estimate this. But Nguyen do better. They actually have up to 16 countries. So that was a little more representative. But the World Trade Cost estimates actually cover many more countries in Africa, about 46, and it's bilateral, it's quite rich. And so we decide to use that as well to adapt using both Nguyen and trade. So first, to just look at the G-range model results on the effect on total biomass, percent change by region. Like I mentioned earlier, Africa and Latin America, the hardest hit. Within Africa, though, it was also interesting to break this down. You do see West Africa and Eastern Africa experiencing much bigger declines. Quickly go there. So getting to the results. We see obviously big gains due to the free trade area in the present period. We first test that. I'm not presenting that here, but this was just to help validate the model. We get projections about 1% change in GDP and positive welfare gains just from introducing the free trade area today, which is what the World Bank also found in their simulations. But now we add this SSP2 scenario to 2040. And of course, the results are going to be much bigger with growth. Change in GDP could be up to 6.7% on just the base. But when we introduce climate change, that drops to about 6.3%. And of course, nothing much is happening in the rest of the world. This is just simulations within Africa on the AfTA, but the AfTA helps to bring that, mitigate that by growth goes up again to 6.5 in this case. Adding climate change effects to these projections reduces some of these gains, but AfTA appears to help mitigate, and particularly really interesting is the welfare effects. You see that happening in total. You almost have the similar welfare effects you'd have without climate change once you have introduced the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. However, this varies by sub-region, as you can see in some of this. And see if I can show some of these variations. And here we're just looking at some of the, first, of course, at the regional level, global level. Africa and Latin America obviously are more affected in terms of experiencing the changes in biomass, and you can see the reductions in GDP as well. But little changes occurring with climate change for those, as opposed to in the case of Africa, the big decline in GDP, and I think this is GDP, yeah, on the top chart. Once we introduce the free trade area, that reduction is much less in the loss in the GDP that you get. When we look within the sub-regions, we see almost a similar pattern across them. Northern Africa and Southern Africa, well, Northern Africa has actually experiences less effects, but you see a much bigger change in Southern Africa, even though it's going towards positive with free trade area. North Africa as well. But you see this mitigation effect taking place in the most affected countries with climate change, Western Africa and Eastern Africa. They do benefit from this as well. Move this forward. Oops. Sorry, just having a problem here. And then also, interesting enough, in terms of its effects on livestock prices, this, of course, we know would have implications for food security. The SSP2 is projected to significantly reduce livestock prices by about 35% in Africa. This is sort of the positive scenario of this growth to 2040 we're seeing, and even as much as 45% for crops. However, climate change effects are projected to temper this. So instead of prices dropping as much as 35% for livestock, they only drop about 31.8%. This, of course, varies quite a bit across the countries in the regions. You see bigger changes for Senegal, but in most cases, the changes are pretty small. And this is something we're still trying to kind of figure out as to what's driving some of this. And I think this could also be a terms of trade effect that's going on by introducing the free trade area. And what of production? Again, not surprising. We see obviously that Africa and Latin America experience the biggest declines in livestock production. However, for Africa, that reduction is also tempered with introducing the free trade area as well. And within Africa, the most, while many experience reductions in production, the exception is actually Southern and North Africa. And these were ones that didn't get as much impact with the changes in biomass, but also they may also be, again, through trade, may also be increasing production to fill the gaps in the other regions. So in summary conclusion, I think you gave me a heads up already. Okay, sorry. So in summary conclusion, the projected decrease of total biomass by 2040 threatens to reduce total land available to support livestock systems greater by almost as much as greater than 10% by 2040. And this, of course, is challenging when we consider the demand for livestock products that's going to keep growing. However, we do see variations in Africa itself, and also not presented here, but crops are also projected to be hard hit. And I think that's an area we may also want to look at. And finally, overall, to conclude, while climate change is projected to reduce welfare and income gains under this SSP2 to 2040, the free trade area has potential to mitigate some of these effects, which is encouraging. Of course, this is very early research we're doing. And one of the things we want to still do is link this to our USDA's International Food Security Model that Jakob leads. And also trying to work with GTAP's agriculturally zoned ecological zone database to better capture some of the variation and heterogeneity that you see even within countries on this change in biomass. And then, of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, 2040, you're not getting much of a bang on the climate change effect. So seeing how we can try to project this out would also be very useful. So thank you for the opportunity and open questions. Yeah.
Have a lot of time for
Okay.
so you may take one question and then take the next question. Maybe you want to take question to Michael?
Nobody asked the question.
Okay.
So do this international baseline. So how do you see the formula
think I want to ask Maros, maybe might be able to answer that one. Yeah.
You know, you're doing international baseline, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Different effect of different things you can simulate and look at the supplies and all that. How would that relate to different?
Yeah.
For the online.
Yeah, that's right. I hope I got this right. So basically USDA has the international baseline work that's ongoing. How would we integrate this work we're doing with that? Yeah.
So the international baseline, the main assumption is
You want to
constant.
come? I think it'd be better if you can.
That's an excellent question. So the international baseline has a key assumption of normal weather. So we normally would not even be, this will not be included in any of our projections. So like, let's say, as Michael said, we're using the CEPI and climate projections. So that usually is not included in international baseline. We would have to run it as a scenario. It would definitely be doable. Of course, these are very different models. So the question is, would we be getting comparable results? And if not, what is the reason? And the reason probably would come from the fact that international baseline is a partial equilibrium model. So it does not model all the markets. Also, it's much more detailed. The GTAP, unfortunately, has historically not been focused on agriculture. And we currently have wheat as a single commodity, but for example, corn is bundled with other grains. So it's not terribly detailed. And that's something that the GTAP Center is working on improving. So we would probably get a slightly different answer. And it would be probably a very useful exercise to see if they would be at least directionally comparable. So I think that's a no, absolutely not. We would have to aggregate heavily the international baseline results to be able to present the numbers side by side. And I think we would lose a lot of detail. Also, the regional aggregation is different. GDAP is actually better. Now it has 158 commodity countries. International baseline has, I don't know on top of my head what is the number of the regions, but probably not more than a few in Africa. So we have Nigeria, we have the entire ECOWAS as a single region. I believe North Africa is a single region. Now GTAP is much more detailed in that regard. So I think these models complement each other a lot. So another good reason to try to run parallel scenarios, perhaps.
I think we can move to the discussion section as well, so we'll have more for question and answer as well. Thanks, so appreciate you with us for the discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to the organizers of this session for inviting me to serve as the discussant for the three papers. The three papers have some similarities, but they're also very different from each other. I would say the two papers on climate have some similarities. You can also see some of the differences. One of the papers only used one extreme scenario, which was the 8.5 RCP, and the one that Jeff presented actually gave us two scenarios, 4.5 and 8.5. And that has implications for the results we get and the inference that we draw from that. But what I want to do is to try to bring everything together as much as possible without going into specific details about each of the papers, because some of the questions and comments that have come up have been helpful, or I've already mentioned some of the things that I will have said, so I don't want to repeat those things. But when I read the title of this session, the focus was linking the African Free Trade Continental Free Trade Agreement to climate and also to to non-tariff measures. I've done a lot of reading on the subject, but not on the climate side. I did some work also for the African Development Bank on this issue. One of the motivation for the key motivation for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is to help increase intra-African trade. Because when you look at the data, you look at different regions, Latin America, North America, Europe, and you look at the level of intra-regional trade, it's relatively high. Goes between 30-something% to 68% in Europe and North America. But when you come to Africa, the level of intra-African trade is quite low. It's usually between 15 to 18%. And there are many reasons for this. So the driving force behind the agreement was to really move forward in the many attempts by the African Union to have more and stronger economic integration. I'm saying that because that's really important for the three analyses and what I think you should do in the future. But I applaud the authors of the three papers because I think that these are really important questions that you've been addressing, because it has implications for the pattern of global trade, and also has strong implications for food security issues globally. So as I look at the three studies, I felt like maybe not enough has been done in linking what you've done to the free trade agreement. And these are some reasons why I think that. I think that for one or two of the papers, the work is done at a very aggregate level. And I think more could be done in actually disaggregating the analysis, because Africa is not homogeneous. The last paper that was presented, I think, did a really good job of showing some of the results across regions. Africa can be divided by the agroecological variations there, because the results will be different. And I think this explains why some of the results were different by regions. In West Africa, some results will make sense for crops that will not make sense in some other regions of Africa. So I think that that's very important, that you pay a little bit more attention to the level of aggregation and the need to decompose the results a little bit more. Another point that I really want to emphasize is also disaggregating or distinguishing the potential effect of the results between how it's going to affect intra-African trade relative to how it's going to affect extra-African trade or global trade. From the perspective of ERS or the US government, you may want to know how may this increase US exports to African countries. But the results you get from that may be different if the initial goal of the agreement is actually achieved, which is to increase intra-African trade. But we also know that the theory of comparative advantage also plays a role here. So cost matters. There is a reason why a lot of products are exported from other countries because it's so much more expensive. And there are some products that cannot be imported from other African countries, no matter how much we try, because it's going to be too costly. But there are some that could be done, and if the efforts are successful, that may influence the pattern of trade between Europe and Africa, between Asia and Africa. For example, poultry. When you look at that graph that was shown earlier, Africa is a net importer of poultry. I will say, actually, there wasn't much shown in terms of exports of poultry. Well, Latin America exports a lot of poultry products. They are net exporters of poultry. If the African Continental Free Trade Agreements achieve what it's supposed to achieve, there will be an expansion in the production of poultry on the African continent, and there will be more trade across regions within the continent. So that will change the picture and the graph that we've been seeing in terms of global trade in poultry with African countries. Another big factor that I think is very important here is the role of regional economic communities within the AU. The AU has 8 regional economic communities. COMESA is a big one. SADC is another big one. ECOWAS is a big one too, and there are several others. And one of the really critical points here is that these RECs are meant to be the implementation block for the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So yes, they will harmonize how policies and trade practices are done on the continent. But at the same time, there are still differences between them. They are not going away. So they will continue to maintain some of their independence. So the question then becomes, how would the activities of these RECs affect the kind of analysis that you've done and the results that you're describing to us? I think that they will play a role. So those are some general comments that I just wanted to put out there as you think about how to enhance the studies that you've done. I will give a couple of specific feedback on a couple of the papers, and then I'll stop so we can have more general discussion. For the first paper, it wasn't clear to me if there was careful job done with the specification of omitted variables. There was a paper by Anderson and Wynkoop in the AER, and there were subsequent studies that have really looked at the role of trade cost and how you specify the gravity model with more attention to the underlying theory. Of course, I didn't have access to the paper. I only saw the PowerPoint. So maybe that has been done well. If not, that's something to pay some closer attention to. I also noticed that there wasn't much distinction made in terms of who wins and who loses. There were references to welfare effects, very broad. I think it will be very helpful and useful to inject a little bit more micro inferences into the discussion of the welfare effects, because these are the kind of things that policymakers are going to be very interested in seeing. And lastly, I just want to make a little bit of a general comment about the simulation models. This is not a critique, it's just an observation, and it's not a new one. The underlying assumptions are critical for the outcome of the simulation models. And usually we don't have a lot of time to go into all the details. I don't see enough details to help me understand some of the very crucial assumptions that went into the specification of those models. I'll give you an example. Why did we have reduction of Ntms by 25%? Why not 10%? Why not 30 or 40%? Why was 8.5 RCP chosen and we didn't have something else as a comparison to that? And lastly, I'll say that these kind of studies are only as useful as much as the level of disaggregation that we can get to in terms of inference. It's very important to provide a very broad perspective as we've been able to do here. But to the extent that we can find ways to disaggregate the more general, more macro viewpoint, the better we'll be able to provide some very useful inference and policy suggestions for those who can use the results from from our analysis. Thank you.
Is there anyone who wants to respond or provide some feedback? You're welcome.
No, thank you. I appreciate some your comments were right on. Some of the discussions will be having internally as well. And this is still very work that we're doing. So this is going to help us move forward a bit and how we look into this. And I expect that like to remind, I think we tend to forget that people like Africa is very different. It's right across and just in terms of people and also in terms of agroecology, finding the constraints, the trade linkages, that got the history, that how do we take care, we address some of these and the comments that you are producing the uniqueness of West Africa as well, and finding affecting it. I think we take it through. That's why I like this comment of I think looking at the sub-regional the REX, economic policies, the policy comes in that I think there's much more impact in the region than Africa Union and that one. So I think
and one thing that we are, because this is a whole research portfolio, many other papers coming, but we are ultimately, obviously, because of who we are looking at the question is how do U.S. exports potentially change? We know we have competition in the region. For example, Brazil. They are not just selling poultry; they're also selling feed to Africa. So we are also looking at those questions.
And I would say that there are several studies that have been done. I know I'm more familiar with all the ones that are done by my colleagues at Michigan State that are looked at the market. All the changes on the demand side, and you alluded to that, the changing demographics, the changes in place and preferences, and how that is influencing the demand structure for the food market, in the food market. And the role and the opportunity that that is opening up for U.S. agribusiness.
Yes.
And that some other countries may kind of jumped to the market more. So the implications for foreign direct investment is also big there. And what's happening with some of these multinationals and larger agribusinesses that are now opening shops in different cities and different parts of Africa. And how many of them are coming from the US and work more and the US too in helping to complement or supplement the effort that are already in ground.
Yeah. So, okay, yeah.
Way forward. I think that's all very relevant work, very important. Not only from a US perspective, but also from an African and European perspective. The World Bank model had suggested that there are very high returns for trade facilitation. Facilitating trade infrastructure, digitalization of border posts, the hard and soft infrastructure of trade. So that is essential, according to a number of other free trade arrangements, modelings, and that would be the two developmental. I think that's having that component of the model scripture. I think another very relevant step, the trade classification. The tariff reductions are showing minuscule effects compared to trade classification. Most
Thank you. Stephen, would you like to make a quick comment also with I think this how the next steps would be in terms of the poultry study and linking it with the AfCFTA and any other possible.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think
And
it's really important.
if you can come here too, because we have audience here online too. Sorry.
Hi, everyone online. I'm just going to talk about linking sort of the poultry. If I get my mask off my glasses. The poultry NTM work with some of sort of the future African Continental Free Trade Agreement negotiations, right? So I think a key part of our work on NTMs is that sort of the protocol on NTMs is still being discussed, as are the protocols on investment and the protocols on sort of, other issues that are coming down. So it's sort of leaving a lot of important stuff on the table, and that all got delayed during the pandemic. So I think where we are, right, that's why we sort of started with this general point. I think the point's really well taken about sort of this acknowledging and better telling the story of the heterogeneity across Africa. So sort of, not presenting this, we can do more to break down the effects of NTMs, not just for the continent as a whole, but also thinking about these things regionally. And I think that's a really good place to take the work. I think your point's well taken about the omitted variable bias. Right now, we're sort of trying to theoretically consistently handle that with those asymmetric pair fixed effects, which is why we lean most heavily on those results. But if we do pursue like a structural gravity approach, that will become even more important. So yeah, I think that's where we're sort of looking at taking the work now.
One more thing on future direction. When I reflect back on that modeling about your way around in Africa, the crucial thing was to disaggregate the two sectors in terms of their resource endowments, their resource requirements, and thinking about Africa's changing demographics and cropland per farm worker and their urbanization patterns and shifts in the capital labor ratios and land to labor ratios of different subsectors. So the question is just disaggregating by subsectors between cattle versus small ruminants versus poultry, for the fed livestock versus the grazing livestock, and then between crop sectors, between the irrigated versus grain-fed versus, just trying to disaggregate a little bit, what is this intra-African trade going to consist of? As the different countries and regions within countries and across, what are the kinds of specialization?
Which sectors benefit, which ones reduce,
and how can the patchiness of Africa become a feature instead of a bug? Because of very different capital labor and the different resource ratios. I don't have any thoughts about how you get at that, but just it seems like you have this tremendous modeling horsepower here, but I didn't see this aggregation by subsector. And that heterogeneity in Africa in the different subsectors having different capital labor and labor ratio to exploit for mutual advantage. Is that something that I don't know, any of these models that have
I don't know, I was gonna say Maro's over there, our workforce.
Also, just for the folks online, let me paraphrase super quickly. Will's question has to do with sort of, can we think about the components of what this intra-Africa trade and the increased trade from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will consist of, and specifically think about sort of disaggregating these things not only by region, but also by subsector.
That's an excellent question again. I like how you call it the workhorse. I think the GTEM model, that's what I think, we all when we think about these models, they can do so many things for us. The issue here is that we have some data deficiencies in a way. I did brag about having 158 regions. There's still some parts of Africa which are not fully disaggregated, which is definitely a problem. When it comes to the sectors, we have even more of an issue. We're at 65 sectors, and there is a very subtle problem with models like GTAP. When we aggregate, we're introducing bias in, let's say, our welfare calculations. Perhaps not as much in changes in quantities, but these models suffer when they're aggregated. So there's a lot of effort going into that to actually maybe even go to as far as all HS commodities, so we would have much more detail. Now, then we run into the computational issues. Currently, GTAP is in GEMPAC, and I think we would not be able to run it if you disaggregate it too much. But it's something that a lot of people are thinking about, so that we can allow this model, which I think works really well, to operate on a much larger, much more disaggregated data set. I'm hoping that within a few years we'll be able to get into that. So having sectors, maybe even sub-regions modeled independently, and that would probably allow us to have much more detailed answers and look at that patchiness of Africa. Well, I don't know if that becomes a feature really. Well, it's just right now it's hidden. We don't even know what it's doing really in GTAP. So yeah, I think that let's just all get to stay tuned to the development of the GTAP model and other models. And
but to be more specific, Will, this is an issue that we're not satisfied with as USDA, because the questions are being asked to answer are becoming more complex. Right now, one of the things that we're working with Purdue specifically is to translate the GTAP model into R. Because once it's in R, we feel like we could add, it's more flexible for us to modify it, add some of these things. Our division director, Sheena Hannaberry, that's why she raised the question about our international baseline modeling, which is, it's a different model, partial equilibrium. We're more modifying that in-house to try and include some of these questions. Because even with GTAP answering climate change questions, it's still lacking. There's a lot of things we need to do. So we are working on it.
Yeah.
I think we very great presentations. I'd like to thank all the three presenters, Fights, for your great discussion as well, and everybody else for your active participation and all great questions as well. So we just run out of time, but it's been great. So I'd like to end the session here, and of course, we're done. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.